The pause was not empty, it was strategy. In that stillness, Crockett commanded the room. She let Miller's arrogance echo against the walls until it became uncomfortable, until even his allies shifted uneasily in their seats. The silence itself was a rebuke, more cutting than any raised voice could have been. Her eyes fixed on him, calm but piercing, the gaze of a woman who had endured far worse than a loud man trying to silence her. Crockett leaned forward slowly, her lips parting with deliberate weight. And then, with a tone as smooth as glass and sharp as a blade, she delivered the line that would replay in clips, retweets, and headlines for days to come. Mr. Miller, if interruptions were intelligence, you'd be a genius. But since they're not, all you've proven tonight is fear. The words sliced through the chamber like a crack of thunder. The rhythm was deliberate, measured to land each syllable where it would hurt most. Her tone did not rise, it did not need to. It was calm, almost casual, the kind of delivery that made the insult sting deeper because it wasn't screamed, it was declared. Miller blinked, his face tightening as though he had been physically struck. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. For the first time all evening, the interrupter had no interruption. The reaction was instantaneous. Gasps rippled through the chamber, sharp intakes of breath, as though the audience had collectively realized they were witnessing a moment larger than a simple exchange. Then came the laughter, quiet at first, then swelling, punctuated by claps and murmurs of astonishment. Even those who had remained stoic until then couldn't contain the smirks tugging at their lips. Crockett did not bask in it. She did not smile or gloat. Instead, she let the reaction unfold around her while maintaining her steady gaze on Miller. Her restraint was the final twist of the knife. She didn't need the crowd's approval to validate her words. The truth in her line spoke for itself. Miller's confidence began to unravel. His usual smirk, so often weaponized as a shield, flickered and faltered. His eyes darted briefly, betraying a search for footing where none existed. His hands fidgeted with his notes, flipping a page though he wasn't reading, as though movement alone could disguise the collapse of his composure. Crockett pressed on, her voice now carrying the effortless authority of someone who had seized control of the entire stage. "You've spoken over me 6 times tonight," she continued, her cadence firm, her expression unwavering. 6 times you thought your noise was more valuable than my words. But the truth, Mr. Miller, is that every interruption you made told us nothing about me, and everything about you. The chamber froze again. The drama had shifted from a duel of words to a dismantling, piece by piece, of Miller's persona. Each phrase Crockett spoke carried the weight of experience, the dignity of patience, and the fire of conviction. "And here's what your interruptions reveal," she said, her tone lower now, almost conspiratorial, as if confiding directly with the audience. "They reveal a man afraid of listening. Afraid of women who won't shrink. Afraid of black voices that refuse to be silenced." The crowd erupted, gasps, applause, and shouts of agreement colliding into a crescendo of energy. For a moment, the chamber felt less like a hearing room and more like a courtroom climax, a verdict delivered not by a jury but by the undeniable force of truth. Miller attempted to speak, his lips forming the beginnings of a retort, but his voice cracked in the effort. It was weak, faltering, drowned out by the reaction surrounding him. He raised a hand, then dropped it. His jaw clenched, but he could not find a weapon sharp enough to counter what had just been leveled against him. Crockett leaned back at last, her body language relaxed, as though she had simply completed a routine duty rather than delivered the moment that would define the exchange. She glanced briefly at her notes, then placed them aside, making it clear that the paper was irrelevant. The power was in her presence, in her voice, in the truth she carried. For a man who interrupted 6 times, the narrator's voice cut in, slow and deliberate, he had no answer on the 7th. The line hung heavy, crystallizing the battle into a single image: Miller silenced, Crockett ascendant. It was the inversion of the power dynamic that had defined so many encounters like this one. The aggressor undone not by louder noise, but by the quiet force of dignity sharpened into precision. The audience, both in the chamber and across the nation, would replay that moment endlessly. The clip would go viral, shared with captions celebrating Crockett's poise, her clapback, her refusal to be diminished. Hashtags like hashtag 7th line and hashtag let her speak would trend for days. But in the room, in the immediate aftermath, the atmosphere shifted into something almost reverent. This was not just a political win, it was a cultural exhale. For every person who had ever been talked over in a meeting, for every woman who had been dismissed by a louder man, for every black voice that had been sidelined in the corridors of power, Crockett's 7th line carried the weight of vindication. Miller sat there, diminished, his swagger gone, his usual arsenal of interruptions rendered useless. He shifted in his chair, his eyes lowered briefly before he forced them back up. But the damage was done. The mask had cracked, the performance had collapsed, and the silence he had tried so desperately to deny Crockett was now his own prison. Crockett, by contrast, had not merely reclaimed her time, she had redefined the terms. Her patience, her restraint, her devastating precision had transformed a heated exchange into a moment of history. And as the murmurs settled, as the room recalibrated in the wake of her words, one truth was undeniable: she had not just spoken. She had triumphed. And yet, this was not the end. Because beyond that chamber, beyond the immediate clash, a larger question lingered, one that would shape the battles still to come. If Stephen Miller could be silenced by dignity sharpened into fire, what might happen when more voices like Jasmine Crockett's refused to be interrupted? The moment Jasmine Crockett delivered her 7th line, the chamber erupted, but the true explosion happened outside those walls. Within minutes, clips of the exchange spread like wildfire across social media. On Twitter, timelines transformed into a living archive of Crockett's poise and Miller's collapse. The hashtag 7th line climbed into trending status before the hearing even adjourned, joined quickly by hashtag let her speak and hashtag Crockett clapback. The video itself became the internet's new obsession. A 7-second clip, perfectly timed from Miller's last interruption to Crockett's devastating reply, looped endlessly on TikTok. Creators stitched it into skits, reenactments, and even musical remixes. DJs layered the line, "If interruptions were intelligence, you'd be a genius. But since they're not, all you've proven tonight is fear over beats," transforming Crockett's voice into an anthem. On Instagram, Reels replayed the moment with captions like, "She spoke for every woman ever silenced." Celebrities chimed in, amplifying the chorus. Ava DuVernay tweeted a simple, "Queen," with the video attached, racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Mark Ruffalo added, "This is how you shut down a bully, with truth, not volume." Even musicians got in on the act, with Lizzo reposting the clip on her story, right? Journalists who had once treated hearings like routine reporting now scrambled to contextualize the drama. Think pieces appeared overnight. The day Stephen Miller finally met his match in Jasmine Crockett's 7th line was more than a clapback, it was a statement. Headlines captured not just the exchange, but the cultural shift it symbolized. But perhaps the most powerful voices weren't the celebrities or the journalists, they were ordinary Americans. Teachers, nurses, delivery drivers, mothers, students, people across the spectrum, took to comment sections and Twitter threads to say, "She spoke for me." A Latina college student wrote, "I've been interrupted in class more times than I can count. Seeing her shut him down gave me chills." A black grandmother posted, "My generation fought for the right to be heard. Tonight, I felt heard." The memes poured in too. One viral image showed Miller holding up 6 fingers with the caption, "Number of interruptions before silence." Another showed Crockett with sunglasses photoshopped onto her face, beneath the words, "Fearless." A particularly brutal meme paired Miller's silenced expression with the phrase, "When you realize noise isn't a substitute for knowledge." Everywhere, the dynamic was the same: Miller, once loud and commanding, reduced to a punchline; Crockett, once interrupted, now amplified to a chorus. The hero/villain contrast leapt off screens and into collective consciousness. Cable news followed suit. Primetime commentators replayed the footage with slow-motion cuts, dramatic pauses, and panel reactions. One progressive anchor summed it up bluntly: "For years, Miller weaponized interruption. Tonight, he met someone who turned silence into a sword. Even conservative outlets, though less willing to praise Crockett, couldn't ignore the virality. Their defense of Miller sounded strained, disconnected, overshadowed by the sheer force of public enthusiasm. The ripple effects weren't confined to politics. Teachers shared the clip in classrooms as an example of rhetorical mastery. Corporate diversity trainers wove it into presentations about workplace dynamics and gendered interruptions. Churches referenced it in sermons, framing it as an allegory about patience, courage, and truth. And through it all, the emotional resonance remained. People didn't just watch Crockett speak, they saw themselves in her. They felt vindicated in their own silenced moments. They recognized their own frustrations mirrored in her calm defiance. She became not just a congresswoman defending her time, but a vessel of dignity standing against arrogance. Yet the speed of the viral storm raised deeper questions. Memes fade, hashtags trend and vanish, clips go viral and then sink into the ocean of yesterday's content. Crockett's moment had become entertainment, empowerment, and inspiration, but was that enough? As the applause echoed across screens and the laughter at Miller's expense filled timelines, one truth loomed just beneath the surface: viral victories can ignite a fire, but whether that fire transforms into lasting change is another story. And that is where the tension lingered. Because this wasn't only about a man silenced in a chamber. It was about who gets to speak in America. Who gets interrupted. Who is heard, and who is dismissed. The memes would fade. The hashtags would shift. But the values exposed in that moment, the arrogance of silencing versus the dignity of speaking truth, would remain. The narrator's voice cut in, solemn yet charged, but beyond the memes, something deeper was at stake. When the laughter quieted, when the memes began to circulate, and when the hashtags trended, Jasmine Crockett understood something deeper than virality. Her seventh line was not just a clapback. It was a reminder. She did not celebrate the silence of Stephen Miller as a personal victory. Instead, she reframed it for the country as a symbol of something larger. Her message was clear: arrogance may be loud, but it is never lasting. Dignity, though quieter, carries a weight that echoes long after the noise fades. Standing in that chamber, she became more than a participant in a heated exchange. She became a living demonstration of a principle older than politics itself: that composure destroys chaos, that patience dismantles bluster, that truth cuts deeper than volume ever can. For every viewer who had endured the sting of being dismissed, Crockett's poise offered a new vision of power. Not the kind of power that shouts others down, but the kind that rises above, forcing arrogance to collapse under its own weight. Her words reminded the nation that justice is not measured in decibels but in the unshakable conviction to stand tall when others try to push you down. The contrast was cinematic. On one side, Miller's interruptions, his frantic noise, his desperate attempt to dominate through volume. On the other, Crockett's stillness, her restraint, her unwavering belief that dignity is its own defense. In that contrast, the lesson crystallized. Noise fades. Composure endures. Her voice, replayed across platforms, became more than a soundbite. It was a call to reimagine what strength looks like in the public square. Strength is not interruption, it is endurance. Strength is not arrogance, it is respect. Strength is not fear disguised as volume, but justice carried with grace. And so, the moment took on a life of its own, not as a fleeting entertainment, but as an allegory for the country. America is, at its core, a debate between arrogance and dignity, between those who silence and those who seek to be heard. Crockett's seventh line was a lesson: arrogance may win the mic. In the weeks that followed, Crockett herself offered reflections that elevated the moment into universal wisdom. She spoke not of Miller, but of justice. Not of interruptions, but of voices long denied. She reminded the nation that respect is not granted by the powerful, it is demanded by those who know their worth. Her lesson was simple yet profound: you cannot interrupt justice. You cannot shout down truth. And you cannot silence dignity. It was this reframing that transformed a viral exchange into a moral parable. The country wasn't simply entertained. It was inspired, nudged toward a vision of politics rooted not in arrogance but in accountability, not in corruption but in courage. The crescendo of her impact was not measured by applause, but by resonance, the quiet conviction people carried into their workplaces, classrooms, and homes. Ordinary Americans repeated her words not just because they were clever, but because they felt true. Because they wanted to live in a country where dignity triumphs over noise, and respect defeats arrogance. And so, the clash between Stephen Miller and Jasmine Crockett became something far larger than either of them. It became a mirror held up to America's face. A choice between the corrosive pull of corruption and the steady march of justice. Crockett's voice, calm and steady, made that choice clear. And the narrator, pulling the threads together, offered the closing note. In the end, Miller's arrogance was just noise. Crockett's dignity was the signal. And the signal endures. And so, the story comes full circle. Stephen Miller interrupted Jasmine Crockett 6 times, believing his noise could bury her voice. But on the 7th, she delivered the line that ended the game. Her words were not only sharp enough to silence him in that chamber, they were powerful enough to echo across the country. Her 7th line shut him. This was never just about one clash. It was about something far deeper. It was about the truth that arrogance, no matter how loud, can never outlast dignity. That corruption and fear will always crumble before justice spoken with calm conviction. Crockett reminded us that interruptions can delay a voice, but they cannot erase it. And in America, the voices that refuse to be erased are the ones that move us forward. If you watched this moment and felt inspired, if you saw yourself, your family, your struggle, your dignity reflected in her words, then let this not be the end. Let it be the beginning. Share this story so others can feel that same spark. Subscribe so we can keep telling these stories, stories where truth triumphs over noise, and where dignity cuts through the arrogance that seeks to silence it. Because in times like these, we need more than entertainment. We need reminders. We need proof that justice can still stand tall. And Jasmine Crockett gave us that proof in 7 unforgettable interruptions. Remember this, dignity is our strongest weapon. The chamber was restless, its fluorescent lights glaring down on rows of tired faces and impatient bodies. Cameras clicked, pens scratched against notepads, and a low murmur buzzed like static in the air. But then, cutting through the background noise like a blade, came his voice. Stephen Miller leaned forward, sharp-tongued and relentless, slicing into Representative Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence. It wasn't the first time. In fact, it had already happened 5 times before. Each interruption more smug, more brazen, more dripping with the arrogance of a man who believed that if he spoke loudly enough, no one else's truth could survive. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Some rolled their eyes. Others smirked, eager for the clash. And Crockett? She stayed steady, her pen poised in her hand, her gaze fixed directly on him, refusing to be rattled. But then came the 6th time. Miller cut across her with the same dismissive wave, the same condescending tone, as if her words, her presence, her very identity didn't matter. The insult wasn't in the words alone, it was in the act itself, a repeated attempt to erase, to silence, to dominate. Viewers watching from home gripped their phones tighter. Social feeds started to ignite. He's doing it again. She won't stand for this. Clips spread in real time, seconds old but already surging across timelines. Crockett took a breath, her silence louder than his outburst. The cameras zoomed in, catching the flicker in her eyes, patience stretched thin but not broken. She let him finish his tirade, every word dripping like acid into the already charged air. And then, with a calmness that unsettled more than any raised voice could, she prepared to deliver her answer. The tension was electric now. The audience in the chamber leaned forward, the country beyond screens held its breath. 6 times he had interrupted her. 6 times he had tried to drown her out. But everyone watching could feel it, something was building. Because on the 7th, it wouldn't be him making headlines. It would be her. And what Jasmine Crockett was about to say would not only silence Stephen Miller in that chamber, it would echo far beyond those walls, leaving millions stunned, outraged, and inspired. This was never just a heated exchange between two people. It was a mirror held up to America itself, reflecting centuries of tension about whose voices are elevated and whose are dismissed. In Stephen Miller's Interruptions, progressive audiences heard more than arrogance, they heard the long, ugly echo of a culture that too often decides who deserves to be listened to, and who can be brushed aside. His pattern wasn't random. It was a performance of dominance, a deliberate signal that he could trample over Crockett's words simply because he believed his own carried more weight. For millions watching, Miller became the emblem of what they had lived through in classrooms, boardrooms, and everyday conversations, the entitled voice that barges in, erases, and insists on control. The interruptions weren't only about policy. They were about power. His every interjection whispered the same poisonous subtext, "Your place is beneath mine." And yet there was Jasmine Crockett. Poised, deliberate, her voice measured even as his tried to bulldoze hers. She represented something larger than one congressional seat. She carried the weight of countless women, particularly women of color, who have been forced to sit silently while being spoken over, only to rise stronger when they finally seize the floor. Her composure was not passivity, it was resistance. Her patience was not weakness, it was strategy. Every second she refused to flinch was a message, "I will not descend to your level, because my dignity is my power." The stakes couldn't have been clearer. To some, this was a political skirmish, just another round of Washington noise. But to others, the ones who saw themselves in Crockett's defiant calm, this was about the very soul of American democracy. Who gets heard? Who gets silenced? Does arrogance win the day, or does justice demand its voice be heard no matter how many times someone tries to bury it? Progressive audiences saw more than a clash of egos. They saw a battle between two Americas, one clinging to a fading hierarchy where interruption is a weapon, and another rising to demand respect, equality, and the right to finish a sentence without being cut short. In that room, Miller wasn't simply challenging Crockett. He was challenging every person who had ever been told their voice didn't matter. And when she finally answered, she wasn't just answering for herself, she was answering for them all. The tension in the chamber was unbearable now. 6 interruptions deep, the audience could sense the weight pressing down, the imbalance of one voice trying again and again to crush another. Yet through it all, Crockett stayed composed, her silence heavy with anticipation. And then, just as she began to speak again, the same thing happened. Stephen Miller didn't enter that chamber as a blank slate. By the time he faced Jasmine Crockett, his reputation had already been etched into American memory. He was known as one of the most hardline political operatives of his generation, a man who built his career not on consensus but on conflict. To his allies, Miller was a strategist with razor-sharp instincts, unafraid to push boundaries. To his critics, he was the very embodiment of arrogance, an ideologue who reveled in disruption, who weaponized hostility as though it were a badge of honor. His rise had been controversial from the beginning. As a young aide, Miller carved out a persona defined by combative rhetoric and unyielding partisanship. He didn't just disagree with opponents, he demeaned them. He didn't just argue policy, he framed debate itself as war. This approach found its full expression in the White House, where he became the architect of some of the most divisive policies of the era. The travel ban. The family separations. The endless speeches portraying immigrants as invaders rather than contributors. These choices made him infamous, a shadowy figure of cold calculation and moral detachment. And yet, beneath the policy battles lay a style that was just as telling. Miller was not a leader who persuaded through the strength of ideas or empathy. His weapon of choice was interruption, the art of never letting another voice finish. He believed in overwhelming opponents, not outthinking them. If he cut in enough, if he barked loud enough, if he projected confidence with enough force, he could dominate the space, regardless of whether his arguments held water. To him, silence was victory, because it meant the other side never got to speak. This pattern was especially sharp when his opponents were women, particularly women of color. Time and again, observers noticed the way his tone sharpened, his interruptions grew quicker, his posture more dismissive. It wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. Miller embodied a tradition as old as American politics itself, the belief that some voices could be muted, and others elevated, simply by the brute force of entitlement. His arrogance wasn't just about policy. It was about hierarchy, about asserting that the old rules still applied in a changing America. For progressives watching, Miller represented everything they sought to dismantle. He was the voice that said, "Stay in your place." He was the wall built in human form, insisting that dignity and equality were privileges, not rights. Every time he cut across Crockett's words, he wasn't just trying to silence her. He was reminding millions of the countless times they had been silenced themselves, in workplaces, in classrooms, in daily life. His interruptions echoed like generational noise, centuries of voices drowned out by those who refused to listen. And yet, for all his bravado, Miller carried within him a fatal flaw: he mistook arrogance for invincibility. He believed that cutting someone off was the same as defeating them, that volume was the same as victory. What he failed to see was that audiences in this new era were no longer impressed by bluster. They were watching for something else: composure, truth, authenticity. And in Crockett, they found a mirror of their own frustrations, their own resilience, their own refusal to stay silent any longer. As Miller interrupted again and again, he seemed unaware of the ground shifting beneath him. He thought he was in control, thought that with each cutoff he was proving dominance. But in reality, each interruption only made Crockett stronger in the eyes of those watching. Each moment of arrogance added to the pressure building in the chamber. Viewers weren't counting Miller's words, they were counting his interruptions. 1, 2, 3. By the sixth, the pattern was undeniable. And here lay the dramatic irony: the very strategy Miller believed would silence Crockett was the one that amplified her. The more he tried to erase her, the more the audience hungered for her voice. His interruptions had become fuel for her fire, setting the stage for a line that would reverberate across the country. Because arrogance, no matter how loud, always has its limits. And Stephen Miller was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the bright lights of the congressional chamber, nor with the television cameras that now follow her every move. It began in quieter places, church pews filled with voices that sang not only of faith, but of survival. Living rooms where hard work and perseverance were not abstract values, but daily necessities. And classrooms where she quickly learned the double standard: excellence was expected of her, but respect was not always guaranteed. From an early age, Crockett stood at the crossroads of identity and expectation. As a young black woman, she was often underestimated before she even opened her mouth. Teachers overlooked her hand in the air. Peers tried to talk over her, not unlike what would later unfold in Congress. But time after time, she pushed through. Her answer to dismissal was preparation, her weapon against arrogance was knowledge. By the time she pursued law, she had already sharpened her skills in a world that demanded she be twice as good just to be considered equal. She carried with her the stories of neighbors evicted from homes, immigrants intimidated by a system they couldn't navigate, families who felt the law was a language spoken only against them, never for them. Crockett chose not the easy path, but the difficult one: defending those voices. Every case she took on was more than paperwork, it was a stand against silence. Her courtroom presence became her signature. She was calm, composed, methodical. Where others might raise their voices, she chose precision. Where others relied on theatrics, she relied on truth. This demeanor would later serve her in Congress, where patience could cut deeper than anger, and restraint could expose the weaknesses of those who mistook loudness for strength. Crockett's rise in politics was not smooth. She faced skepticism at every step, doubts about her age, her gender, her race. Critics questioned whether she had the experience, the coded language often used to keep barriers intact. But she answered not with bitterness, but with results. In every debate, in every public forum, she leaned on facts, on preparation, on the clarity of her voice. And slowly, respect was no longer optional. It became unavoidable. For progressive audiences, Crockett's journey resonates deeply because it mirrors so many of their own. She is the daughter, the sister, the neighbor who had to work harder for less recognition. She is the friend who knew she had to stay calm while others shouted over her, because the stakes were too high to lose composure. She is the professional who understood that every interruption wasn't just a personal slight, it was part of a pattern designed to keep her in the margins. And yet, she refused the margins. Instead, she claimed the center. Her run for Congress was not fueled by ego but by service. She entered the chamber carrying with her the voices of those often shut out, the resilience of those who had endured, and the conviction that democracy only thrives when all its citizens are allowed to speak. By the time she faced Stephen Miller, she had already spent a lifetime preparing for moments exactly like this. Every overlooked hand in the classroom, every dismissal in the courtroom, every doubt about her capacity, they had all built her into a woman whose strength was not in out-yelling her opponent, but in outlasting him. By years of experience, was her shield against the kind of arrogance Miller embodied. As Miller spoke over her again and again, viewers could see in her posture the weight of those years. The tilt of her head, the stillness of her hand, the refusal to rush or stumble, it was the composure of someone who knew that storms eventually collapse under their own noise. She didn't need to match his interruptions with interruptions of her own. She only needed to wait, to time her response, and to let the moment arrive. And when the seventh interruption came, the one Miller believed would finally shatter her patience, Crockett was ready. And on that seventh interruption, all of her years of struggle and preparation converged in one moment. The chamber was quiet at first, the kind of tense silence that precedes a storm. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, ready to speak, her notes steady in her hands, her voice measured. But the moment her lips parted, Stephen Miller pounced. "Congresswoman," he barked, cutting her off mid-sentence. The interruption was sharp, jagged, designed not to clarify but to dominate. Crockett didn't flinch. She waited, the corners of her mouth twitching in restraint, letting his words spill into the room like static. And when he finally paused, she resumed as though nothing had happened. But Miller wasn't finished. Again he lunged in, his tone dripping with derision, his body leaning forward with the swagger of a man convinced that volume equaled authority. Twice interrupted. Then a third. The audience watching, both in the room and across the country, shifted in their seats. Some leaned forward in disbelief, others clenched fists in frustration. The pattern was becoming unmistakable, every time she spoke, he would not let her finish. Crockett, though, remained unshaken. She placed her pen down slowly, folding her hands in front of her as though grounding herself in patience. Her eyes fixed on him, not with anger, but with the kind of calm that unsettles aggressors. Each measured glance told its own story. "I see you. I hear you. And I will not bend." By the fourth interruption, murmurs rippled through the crowd. People exchanged looks. A few shook their heads. It was no longer just a debate, it was a spectacle, one that revealed more about Miller than about Crockett. His tone had grown sharper, his volume louder, but his words lacked weight. He wasn't building an argument, he was throwing punches made of noise. The fifth time, Crockett adjusted her microphone with deliberate precision. Her voice was even, steady, refusing to rise to his bait. She spoke slowly, each syllable pronounced with crystalline clarity, as though daring him to try again. And he did. Sixth interruption. This time, his voice rose an octave, dripping with condescension, his words tangled with disdain. It was a performance of arrogance, the kind meant to drown out reason itself. By now, the audience's frustration had reached a fever pitch. Viewers at home tweeted in real time, the hashtag "Let Her Speak" beginning to climb. People recognized what was unfolding, a living, breathing portrait of the very culture Crockett had long fought against, the silencing of women, the dismissal of black voices, the swagger of unchecked privilege. Still, Crockett sat there, her shoulders squared, her expression composed, a masterclass in restraint. To some, it seemed infuriating. To others, it was mesmerizing. How long could she take this? How long until the patience of a lifetime finally cracked under the weight of Miller's arrogance? To finish this time? Or would his voice crash in again like a wave smashing against stone? The answer came quickly. She began again, calm, steady, deliberate. And once more, Miller's voice surged over hers, harsh and insistent. 7. That was the breaking point. But it wasn't the outburst he expected. Crockett didn't slam her hands on the desk. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't match his rage with rage of her own. Instead, she paused. A silence stretched through the room, long enough for even Miller to falter, uncertain. She looked at him, not as an equal opponent, but as if studying a child mid-tantrum. And then, with words sharpened by patience and years of preparation, she began to speak again. The room leaned forward. The audience held its breath. Because this time, Miller would not leave unscathed. And then, her patience snapped, but not in the way anyone expected. For a moment, the room was suspended in silence. Stephen Miller's last interruption still hung in the air, jagged and bitter, but Jasmine Crockett did not meet it with immediate fire. Instead, she sat back, her posture unyielding yet composed, her hands folded neatly as though she were weighing her next move with surgical precision.